The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains, sending a flock of startled birds into the evening sky as Jessie Harmon crouched behind a weathered boulder, her heart pounding against her ribs. Blood trickled down her arm from where the bullet had grazed her, but she couldn't afford to think about that now. Not when freedom was just yards away, tethered to a hitching post outside the small trading post. The magnificent chestnut stallion stomped impatiently, as if sensing the desperation in her eyes. The year was 1875, and the Wyoming Territory offered little mercy to a woman on the run. Jessie peered around the edge of the boulder, her breath caught in her throat as she watched the men who'd been pursuing her ride in the opposite direction, following a false trail she'd laid hours earlier. The distraction wouldn't last long. Silas Turner and his gang weren't known for their patience or forgiveness. Not when she carried evidence that could send them to the gallows. As twilight deepened across the landscape, Jessie knew it was now or never. Her own horse had collapsed from exhaustion miles back, and without a mount, she was as good as dead. Gathering the tattered remains of her courage, she slipped from behind the boulder and crept toward the hitching post, keeping low and moving as silently as her boots would allow on the gravelly ground. The chestnut stallion's ears flicked toward her as she approached, its intelligent eyes regarding her with what seemed like curious suspicion. It was a magnificent animal, powerful muscles rippling beneath its gleaming coat, standing at least 16 hands high. A horse built for endurance and speed, exactly what she needed. "Easy now," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand to stroke its velvety muzzle. "I'm sorry about this, but I need your help more than your owner does right now." Her fingers worked quickly at the knot securing the reins to the hitching post. Just as she loosened them, the trading post's door swung open with a creak that sounded like thunder in her ears. Jessie froze, one foot already in the stirrup, as a tall figure filled the doorway. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, madam." The voice was deep, unhurried, with a hint of amusement that made her blood boil despite her fear. Jessie turned slowly, finding herself staring into the steely blue eyes of a man who seemed entirely too calm for someone witnessing a horse theft. He leaned against the doorframe, a tall glass of whiskey in one hand, the other resting casually near the holstered Colt at his hip. Dusty from the trail, his dark hair fell in waves beneath a well-worn hat, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. His duster bore the marks of long days in the saddle, but there was nothing worn down about the way he carried himself. "I need this horse," Jessie said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's life or death." The stranger took a slow sip of his whiskey, studying her over the rim of his glass. His gaze took in her bloodied sleeve, the dirt on her face, the desperation in her eyes. Something shifted in his expression, not pity, but something more complex. "Whose death would that be?" he asked, setting his glass down on a barrel beside the door. "Mine, if I don't get far from here by morning." Jessie didn't release the reins, though her chances of escaping had dwindled to almost nothing. "Please. They've already killed 2 people trying to get to me." The stranger stepped forward and Jessie tensed, ready to fight or flee, though neither option seemed promising. To her surprise, he didn't reach for his gun or even for the horse. Instead, he extended his hand, palm up. "Preston Reed," he said, "and that's my horse you're trying to steal." Tempest doesn't take kindly to strangers, especially those planning to ride him hard and leave him somewhere to die. "I wouldn't," Jessie began to protest, but the words died on her lips. That had been exactly her plan, to ride the horse until she reached the next town, then set it loose. Preston's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're bleeding, you're terrified, and you're running from something serious enough to risk hanging for horse theft." He glanced toward the horizon, then back at her. "Ride with me instead." Jessie blinked, certain she'd misheard him. "What?" "Tempest can carry us both. I know these lands better than most, including the places where a person might disappear for a while." He stepped closer, still not touching the horse or her. "But I won't have my horse stolen, and I don't abandon folks in trouble." "So those are your choices: ride with me, or find another way out of whatever mess you're in." "You don't know me," Jessie said suspiciously. "Why would you help?" Preston's mouth curved in a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's just say I recognize the look of someone running from something worse than death." He glanced at her bleeding arm. Besides, seems like you could use a bit of patching up before you bleed all over my saddle. Before Jessie could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats made them both stiffen. Preston's casual demeanor vanished instantly as he assessed the situation with quick efficiency. "Those friends of yours?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "They're not my friends," Jessie whispered, her face paling. "That's Silas Turner and his gang. They've been tracking me for 3 days." Something dangerous flashed in Preston's eyes at the name. Without another word, he stepped forward, lifted Jessie bodily and set her in the saddle, then swung up behind her in one fluid motion. His arms came around her to take the reins, his chest a solid wall against her back. "Hold on," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Tempest lives up to his name." With a soft click of his tongue, Preston urged the horse forward, not in a panicked gallop that would draw attention, but in a steady canter that quickly carried them away from the trading post and into the deepening shadows of the surrounding woods. Jessie held her breath as they rode, expecting shouts or gunfire to follow them, but the only sounds were the rhythmic hoofbeats of the horse beneath them and the whisper of wind through the trees. Preston guided Tempest with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going, even as the last light faded from the sky. "We need to put some distance between us and that trading post," Preston said after they'd been riding for nearly an hour. "But first, that arm needs attention. There's a creek about half a mile ahead where we can stop briefly." True to his word, Preston soon guided Tempest down a nearly invisible path that led to a small creek gurgling through a stand of cottonwoods. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Jessie down, his hands strong and steady around her waist. The moment her feet touched the ground, her knees buckled from exhaustion and blood loss. Preston caught her before she fell, his arms slipping around her waist. "Easy now," he said, the same words she'd used earlier with his horse. "Let's get you sitting down." He helped her to a flat rock beside the creek, then retrieved a small leather kit from his saddlebag. Kneeling beside her, he gently rolled up her torn sleeve to examine the wound. "It's just a graze," he said after a moment. "Messy but not deep. Lucky." "Doesn't feel lucky," Jessie muttered, wincing as he began to clean the wound with water from the creek and a clean cloth. "Being chased by Silas Turner and still breathing, I'd call that fortunate." Preston's hands were surprisingly gentle for their size and strength. "Most folks who cross Turner don't live to regret it." "You know him?" Jessie asked sharply. Preston's expression hardened. "I know of him. Most people in these parts do." "Rustler, thief, murderer, though nothing that's ever stuck in court." He wrapped a clean bandage around her arm with practiced efficiency. "Which brings me to my next question. What did you do to earn his particular attention?" Jessie hesitated. She'd spent the last 3 days trusting no one, running on instinct and fear. But this man had already put himself at risk by helping her, and if they were going to ride together, he deserved some truth. "I was working as a bookkeeper at the bank in Bitter Springs," she began, watching his face carefully. "I noticed discrepancies in some accounts, money coming in that didn't match what was being recorded officially. When I looked deeper, I found evidence of Turner laundering money through the bank with the help of the manager, Harold Sims." Preston's eyebrows rose slightly. "And you confronted them?" "No," Jessie shook her head. "I copied the ledger entries, gathered what proof I could. I was planning to take it to the marshal the next morning." She swallowed hard. "But Sims must have realized what I'd found. That night, Turner and his men came to my boarding house. I barely got out through the window before they broke down the door. Her voice faltered. "They killed my neighbor when she told them she didn't know where I'd gone. And you've been running ever since," Preston finished for her, "with evidence that could hang Turner." Jessie nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to the inner pocket of her jacket where the folded papers remained hidden. Preston stood and offered his hand to help her up. "We should keep moving. Even at night, we're not far enough from that trading post for comfort." As they mounted Tempest again, Jessie found herself wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake trusting this stranger with her story. For all she knew, he could be taking her straight to Turner for a reward. But as his arms came around her again to hold the reins, There was something in the solid presence of him that eased her fear rather than heightened it. "Where are we going?" she asked as they set off again, the horse picking its way confidently through the darkness. "I have a cabin," Preston replied. "It's about 4 hours' ride from here, hidden in the foothills. Not many people know about it, and those who do have no reason to connect it to me." "A hiding place," Jessie said. She felt rather than saw his nod. "Everyone needs one, sooner or later in this country." They rode in silence for a time, the rhythm of the horse's movement lulling Jessie despite her anxiety. The night was cool but not cold, with a crescent moon providing just enough light to navigate by. After nearly 2 hours, Preston spoke again. "You should rest if you can," he said. "I'll keep you from falling." "Why are you doing this?" Jessie asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since they'd fled the trading post. "You don't know me. You have no stake in this fight." Preston was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally did, his voice was low and thoughtful. 5 years ago, I watched Silas Turner and his men burn a family's homestead to the ground because the father wouldn't sell his water rights. The law did nothing because Turner had the sheriff in his pocket. His arms tightened almost imperceptibly around her. "I've been waiting for someone brave enough to stand against him with proof that might stick. Seems like that someone is you, Miss Harmon," she supplied. "Jessie Harmon." "Well, Miss Harmon, consider this my contribution to justice." Something in his tone told Jessie there was more to the story than he was sharing, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her, making it difficult to press further. Despite her determination to stay alert, she found herself leaning back against his chest, her eyes growing heavy. "Rest," Preston said again, his voice a reassuring rumble against her back. "I'll wake you if there's trouble." Jessie hadn't planned to sleep, but the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her and the warmth of the man behind her conspired against her vigilance. Her last conscious thought was that she was putting her life in the hands of a complete stranger, and somehow, it felt like the safest decision she'd made in days. Dawn was breaking when Jessie woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. She was still on horseback, still cradled against Preston Reed's chest, but the landscape had changed dramatically. They were riding through a narrow pass between steep forested hills, with no sign of a trail that she could discern. "Good morning," Preston said, his voice rough with fatigue. "You slept through the worst part of the journey. These last few miles are actually pleasant in the daylight." Jessie straightened, embarrassed to realize she had been essentially sleeping in his arms. "You should have woken me. You've been riding all night." "I've gone longer without rest," he replied simply. "Besides, you needed it more than I did." As they emerged from the pass, Jessie caught her breath at the view that greeted them. Nestled in a small, sheltered valley was a cabin built of sturdy logs, with a corral beside it and a thin wisp of smoke rising from the stone chimney. A creek tumbled down from the hillside, providing water while the surrounding forest offered both protection and privacy. It was the kind of place most people could ride past a dozen times without noticing, hidden as it was among the natural contours of the land. "Someone's there," Jessie said tensely, noting the smoke. "That would be Joseph," Preston explained. "Old Cheyenne man who watches the place when I'm gone. He's trustworthy." As they approached, an elderly native man emerged from the cabin, leaning on a wooden staff. He raised a hand in greeting, his weathered face breaking into a smile as he recognized Preston. Preston dismounted first, then helped Jessie down. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, and she swayed slightly as she found her footing. Preston kept a steadying hand at her elbow until he was sure she was stable. "Joseph, this is Miss Jessie Harmon," Preston said, speaking clearly but with obvious respect. "She'll be staying here for a while." "Miss Harmon, this is Joseph Two Rivers, the wisest man I know and the best tracker this side of the Continental Divide." Joseph's dark eyes took in Jessie's disheveled appearance, the bandage on her arm, and the exhaustion evident in her posture. He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "The trouble follows behind you," he said, his English accented but clear. "But not close yet. Come inside, there is food." Preston led Tempest toward the corral, glancing back at Jessie. "Go on in, I'll tend to the horse and join you." The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, and two doors leading to what Jessie presumed were bedrooms. A fire burned low in the stone fireplace, and the scent of coffee and something savory filled the air. Joseph gestured to a wooden table where 3 bowls of stew sat waiting. "Sit," he said. "Eat, then sleep. Questions come later." Too exhausted to argue, Jessie sank onto one of the chairs and picked up a spoon. The stew was rich with venison and wild onions, and she hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite touched her tongue. By the time Preston entered the cabin, she had nearly finished the bowl. "Good to see your appetite returning," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee before sitting down to his own meal. "That's usually the first sign of recovery." "Recovery from what?" Jessie asked. "Fear," Joseph answered simply, taking the third seat. "It eats more than hunger." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Jessie could feel both men watching her, though neither stare felt threatening. When she finally set down her spoon, Preston spoke. "Joseph will ride to town tomorrow for supplies and to listen for news. In the meantime, you should rest." "There's a bedroom through that door," he nodded toward the right. "Fresh water in the basin if you want to clean up." "And what happens after I rest?" Jessie asked, suddenly needing to understand what came next. "I can't stay hidden forever." "Those papers need to reach a federal marshal, not a local one who might be in Turner's pocket." Preston nodded. "I've been thinking about that. The territorial circuit judge will be in Laramie in 10 days. Judge Harrington has a reputation for being incorruptible. If we can get your evidence to him directly, Turner won't be able to buy his way out." 10 days, Jessie repeated, calculating. "Turner won't stop looking for me." "No," Preston agreed, "but he won't find you here. This place isn't on any map, and Joseph has made sure the approach is virtually invisible unless you know what you're looking for." Joseph made a soft sound that might have been amusement. "Even the deer get lost finding this place." Despite her exhaustion, Jessie smiled at that. "Thank you. Both of you, I know I'm bringing danger to your doorstep." "Danger was already there," Preston said, his expression darkening momentarily. "You're just giving us a chance to face it on our terms." He stood, taking his coffee with him. "Get some rest, Miss Harmon. We'll talk more when you've slept." The bedroom was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in handmade quilts, a small chest for clothing, and a window that looked out into the forest. Jessie used the water in the basin to wash away the dirt and blood from her journey, then changed into a clean shirt that had been left folded on the bed, clearly Preston's, from the size, but welcome nonetheless. As she lay down, she could hear the low murmur of voices from the main room, Preston and Joseph talking, though she couldn't make out the words. There was something reassuring about the sound, about knowing she wasn't alone for the first time in days. Despite the questions still swirling in her mind about Preston Reed and his willingness to help her, Jessie felt herself drifting into sleep, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had been fighting. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was that she tried to steal a horse and ended up with something far more valuable an ally in a fight she'd been losing on her own. When Jessie woke, the quality of light coming through the small window told her it was late afternoon. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself to her surroundings, before the events of the previous day and night came rushing back. Sitting up, she noticed clean clothes folded at the foot of the bed, a pair of men's trousers that would be too large but manageable with a belt, a faded blue shirt, and thick wool socks. She dressed quickly, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs to make the borrowed clothes fit better. Her own blood-stained clothing had been removed, presumably to be washed. Before leaving the room, she checked the inner pocket of her jacket where she'd sewn the incriminating bank documents. They were still there, safe for now. The main room was empty when she emerged, though the fire still burned low in the hearth. Through the open front door, she could see Preston chopping wood in the yard, his back to the cabin. He'd removed his duster and shirt in the afternoon heat, and Jessie found herself momentarily transfixed by the play of muscles across his sun-bronzed back as he swung the axe in a smooth, practiced motion. She stepped onto the small porch, and Preston turned as if sensing her presence. He paused, axe resting against the chopping block, and wiped the sweat from his brow with his forearm. "Good afternoon," he said, reaching for his shirt and pulling it on. "Feeling better?" "Much," Jessie admitted. "Where's Joseph?" "Gone hunting. He'll be back by nightfall." Preston gestured toward a bucket near the well. "There's fresh water if you're thirsty." Jessie filled a dipper and drank deeply, suddenly aware of how parched she was. As she lowered the dipper, she found Preston watching her with an unreadable expression. "What is it?" she asked. "Just wondering how a bookkeeper from Bitter Springs ended up with the courage to stand against Silas Turner when most men in the territory won't." Jessie set the dipper down. "When you see evil happening in front of you and do nothing, you become part of it." She met his gaze steadily. "I couldn't live with that." Something flickered in Preston's eyes, respect, perhaps, or recognition. "No," he said quietly, "neither could I." An unspoken understanding passed between them, a sense that they shared more than just a common enemy. Jessie looked away first, uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. "Is there anything I can help with?" she asked, gesturing around the homestead. "I'm not used to sitting idle." Preston smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "As it happens, I was about to check the snares." "You're welcome to join me, if you're up for a short walk." They set off along a narrow path that wound through the trees surrounding the cabin. Preston moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness, pausing occasionally to point out a particular plant or animal sign to Jessie. "You know these woods well," she observed as they checked the first snare, which had caught a plump rabbit. Preston reset the snare after retrieving their dinner. "I've been coming here since I was 16. It was Joseph's cabin originally. He taught me how to track, how to live off the land." He glanced at her. "How to disappear when necessary. And was it necessary often?" Jessie asked, curious about this man who had so readily come to her aid. A shadow crossed Preston's face. "A few times." He didn't elaborate, and Jessie didn't press. Everyone had secrets in this territory, some darker than others. They checked 4 more snares, finding 2 more rabbits, before heading back to the cabin. As they walked, Preston asked about her life before Bitter Springs, and Jessie found herself telling him about growing up in Ohio, losing her parents to influenza when she was 18, and heading west to start a new life with the bookkeeping skills her father had taught her. "I never planned to stay in Wyoming," she admitted. "I was saving for a ticket to San Francisco. I heard they have real opportunities for women in business there." "And now?" Preston asked, holding a branch aside for her to pass. Jessie sighed. "Now I just want to live long enough to see Turner answer for his crimes." When they returned to the cabin, Preston showed her how to prepare the rabbits for cooking, his hands deft and sure as he demonstrated the process. They worked side by side, and Jessie found herself enjoying the simple domesticity of the task, despite the circumstances that had brought her there. As twilight descended, Joseph returned with a brace of grouse to add to their meal. The 3 of them ate together around the table, and Jessie noticed how the 2 men interacted not with the formality of employer and employee, but with the easy familiarity of family. After dinner, as Joseph went to check on the horses, Preston spread a map across the table and began to explain his plan to get Jessie safely to Laramie. "The direct route would be too dangerous," he said, tracing a line with his finger. "Turner will have men watching the main trails. We'll need to go north first, then circle back down through the mountains here." He tapped a spot on the map. "It's rough country, but Tempest can handle it, and Turner's men won't expect us to take such a difficult path." Jessie questioned. "You're coming with me." Preston looked up, his blue eyes serious. "Did you think I'd just point you in the right direction and wish you luck? Turner has men all over the territory. You'll need someone watching your back until those papers reach Judge Harrington's hands." "I can't ask you to risk your life like that," Jessie protested, though a part of her was deeply relieved at the thought of not facing the journey alone. "You didn't ask," Preston replied simply. "I offered." Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them again, a connection that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing hour. Jessie felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the hearth. "Thank you," she said softly. Preston nodded once, then returned his attention to the map. We should leave in 3 days. That gives us enough time to prepare and for you to regain your strength. It'll be a hard ride, even with the route I've planned." Later that night, as Jessie lay in bed listening to the night sounds filtering through the cabin walls, she found herself thinking about Preston Reed and the mystery he presented. A man who lived with one foot in civilization and one in the wilderness. A man willing to risk everything to help a stranger bring down a notorious criminal. A man whose touch, even when purely practical, sent an unexpected warmth through her veins. It was dangerous thinking, she knew. Her situation was precarious enough, without complicating it with feelings she had no right to explore. And yet, as sleep began to claim her once more, it was Preston's face she saw, those steady blue eyes, the way his rare smile transformed his features, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. Tomorrow, she told herself firmly, she would focus solely on preparing for the journey ahead. Justice for Turner's victims had to remain her priority. Anything else would have to wait for a time when her life wasn't hanging in the balance. But even as she made this resolution, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that perhaps the two weren't as separate as she wanted to believe. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and unexpected moments of connection. Jessie insisted on contributing to the work around the cabin, refusing to be treated as a guest when both men were risking so much on her behalf. She helped Joseph preserve meat for their journey, gathered herbs from the small garden behind the cabin, and even convinced Preston to teach her the basics of shooting with his spare revolver. "Your stance is too rigid," he told her during their first lesson, standing behind her as she aimed at a row of cans placed on a fallen log. "Relax your shoulders." Jessie tried to follow his instruction, but tension remained locked in her body. With a sigh, Preston stepped closer, his chest nearly touching her back as he gently repositioned her arms. "Like this," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "Feel the balance of the gun in your hand. It's an extension of your arm, not something separate from you." Jessie was acutely aware of his proximity, of the subtle scent of pine and leather that seemed to cling to him, of the careful way his hands guided hers without taking control. She forced herself to focus on the target instead of the man behind her, squeezing the trigger as he'd taught her. The can flew off the log with a satisfying ping. "I did it," she exclaimed, turning to face Preston with a smile of triumph. He was closer than she'd realized, and her sudden movement brought them chest to chest, her face tilted up to his. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Jessie watched as Preston's eyes darkened slightly, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before he took a deliberate step back. "Good shot," he said, his voice a shade rougher than it had been. "Let's try the next one." The moment passed, but Jessie couldn't forget the look in his eyes or the way her heart had raced at their closeness. It was a complication she didn't need, and yet she couldn't bring herself to regret it. On the evening before their planned departure, Joseph announced that he would ride to the nearest town to listen for news of Turner's movements. Despite Preston's concerns about the risk, the older man was adamant. "Better to know where the snake lies before you walk the path," he said firmly. "I will return by midnight. Be ready to leave at dawn." After Joseph had gone, a strange quiet settled over the cabin. Jessie and Preston moved around each other with a new awareness as they completed the final preparations for their journey. When there was nothing left to do but wait, they sat together at the table, a pot of coffee between them. "Are you afraid?" Preston asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Jessie considered the question seriously. "Yes," she admitted, "but not of dying exactly. I'm afraid of failing. Of Turner escaping justice again because I wasn't smart enough or brave enough to see this through." Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Fear can be useful if you don't let it control you. It keeps you sharp." He poured more coffee into her cup. "But for what it's worth, I think you're one of the bravest people I've ever met." Jessie looked down, uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." "No," Preston said quietly. "You're not. Most people would have looked the other way when they found those discrepancies. Most people would have convinced themselves it wasn't their problem." He leaned forward slightly. "You didn't. That makes you exceptional, Jessie Harmon." It was the first time he'd used her given name without the formality of Miss, and something about the way it sounded in his deep voice made her look up and meet his gaze. "Why did you really help me, Preston?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since that first night. The truth this time. Preston was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tinged with old pain. 5 years ago, Turner didn't just burn that homestead I told you about. The family inside the Millers, they were friends of mine. John Miller had testified against Turner in a cattle rustling case. The charges were dismissed, but Turner didn't forget. His jaw tightened. They died because I convinced John his testimony was the right thing to do. I promised him I'd make sure he and his family were protected. Jessie reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "It wasn't your fault. I should have known Turner would retaliate. I should have been there." Preston's eyes met hers, raw with remembered grief. "By the time I arrived, the house was already engulfed. I couldn't get to them. And the law did nothing," Jessie finished softly, understanding now his determination to help her. Preston nodded. The local sheriff was in Turner's pocket. The territorial marshal said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue federal charges. His hand turned beneath hers, their fingers intertwining almost of their own accord. "When you showed up trying to steal my horse with Turner's men on your heels and evidence against him in your pocket. It felt like a second chance, a way to finally make things right." The honesty in his voice touched something deep inside Jessie. Without thinking, she stood and moved around the table, drawn to him by a force she couldn't name. Preston rose to meet her, their hands still joined. "We'll make it right together," she promised, looking up at him. "For the Millers, for my neighbor, for everyone Turner has hurt." Something shifted in Preston's expression, a softening, a surrender to something he'd been fighting. His free hand came up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather light against her cheek. "Jessie," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. The moment was shattered by the sound of a horse approaching at speed. They broke apart, Preston's hand immediately going to his holstered revolver as he moved to the window. "It's Joseph," he said with relief, though tension remained in his shoulders. "Something's wrong, he's riding too fast." They hurried onto the porch as Joseph reined his horse to a stop in the yard, his normally composed expression tight with urgency. "Turner's men are in the hills," he said without preamble. "They found one of my old trails. They will be here by morning." Preston's expression hardened. "How many?" "6 that I saw, maybe more behind." Joseph dismounted, moving with the agility of a much younger man despite his age. "We must leave now under cover of darkness." Jessie felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. "I've brought this down on you, I'm sorry." "No time for that," Preston said, already moving toward the cabin. "Joseph, can you delay them?" The older man nodded grimly. "I can lead them away from your trail, buy you half a day, maybe more. That's all we need to reach the high pass." Preston turned to Jessie. "Get your things. We leave in 10 minutes." The next moments passed in a blur of focused activity. Jessie retrieved her jacket with its precious hidden documents while Preston and Joseph gathered the supplies they'd prepared. Within minutes, Tempest was saddled and loaded, his powerful frame betraying no sign of concern at the midnight departure. As Preston helped Jessie mount, Joseph approached with something wrapped in soft leather. "Take this," he said, pressing the bundle into her hands. "Medicine for the journey. And this." He placed a small carved wooden talisman on top. "For protection." "Thank you," Jessie said, deeply moved by the old man's kindness. "For everything." Joseph nodded once, then turned to Preston. The two men clasped forearms in a gesture that spoke of deep respect and affection. "May your path be clear and your aim true," Joseph said formally. "And yours," Preston replied. "Be careful, old friend." "It is not me they seek," Joseph reminded him with a hint of his usual dry humor. "Now go, I will find you when it is safe." Preston swung up behind Jessie, his arms encircling her as he took the reins. With a final nod to Joseph, he urged Tempest forward into the darkness, away from the sanctuary that had briefly been theirs and toward an uncertain future. They rode hard through the night, following game trails and narrow passes that Jessie would never have noticed without Preston's guidance. The moon provided just enough light to navigate, though there were stretches where Jessie had to trust completely in Preston's knowledge of the terrain and Tempest's sure-footedness. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew colder. Jessie was grateful for the warmth of Preston's chest against her back, for the way his arms seemed to shelter her from the biting wind. They spoke little, saving their breath and focus for the treacherous path, but there was comfort in their shared silence, a sense of purpose that united them beyond words. Dawn was breaking as they reached a high ridge overlooking a vast expanse of wilderness. Preston finally reined Tempest to a stop, allowing both horse and riders a much-needed rest. He dismounted first, then helped Jessie down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "We should be safe here for a short while," he said, leading Tempest to a small stream that trickled between the rocks. "Turner's men won't know these trails, and Joseph will make sure they follow false leads in the other direction." Jessie stretched her stiff muscles, looking out over the breathtaking vista before them. From this height, the world seemed impossibly vast and untamed, the problems of humans small in comparison to the ancient mountains and endless sky. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Preston came to stand beside her, his gaze following hers. "This is why I stayed in Wyoming, even after everything that happened. There's something about this land that gets into your blood." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, sharing the view and the brief respite from their flight. Then Preston reached into one of the saddlebags and produced a packet of jerky and hardtack. "Not exactly a feast," he said with a wry smile, "but it'll keep us going until we can risk a fire." They ate quickly, washing the simple food down with water from the stream. As they prepared to continue their journey, Jessie noticed Preston studying the sky with a frown. "What is it?" she asked. "Weather's changing," he replied, nodding toward clouds building on the western horizon. "We might be in for a storm by nightfall. We need to reach the old line shack in Blacktail Canyon before it hits." They mounted again, Jessie settling back against Preston's chest with a familiarity that no longer felt strange. As they set off along the ridge, she found herself thinking that for all the danger pursuing them, there was something exhilarating about this journey, about the wildness of the country around them, about the man whose strength and courage had become her anchor in the storm. It was a dangerous path they traveled, in more ways than one. But as Tempest carried them deeper into the mountains, Jessie couldn't help feeling that whatever awaited them at the end of this journey, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The storm caught them just as the sun was setting, sweeping across the mountains with a fury that made Jessie gasp. Rain lashed at them in horizontal sheets driven by howling wind, while lightning split the darkening sky in jagged bursts of blinding light. "Hold on." Preston shouted over the thunderous downpour, urging Tempest forward along a barely visible trail that hugged the side of a steep ravine. "The shack is just ahead." Jessie clung to the saddle horn, her body pressed back against Preston's chest as much for warmth as for stability. She was soaked to the skin despite the oilskin coat he'd wrapped around her shoulders earlier, and cold had settled deep into her bones. Only the solid presence of Preston behind her kept panic at bay as Tempest picked his way carefully along the treacherous path. Lightning flashed again, illuminating a small, weathered structure nestled against the cliff face ahead. The line shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a lean-to stable attached, but to Jessie's eyes, it looked like salvation itself. Preston guided Tempest directly to the lean-to, dismounting quickly and lifting Jessie down before seeing to the horse. Her legs nearly buckled as they touched the ground, stiff from hours in the saddle and numb with cold. "Go inside," Preston urged, pressing a key into her hand. "Get a fire started. I'll take care of Tempest." The door creaked open on rusty hinges, revealing a Spartan interior, a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot pushed against one wall, and shelves holding basic supplies. It was dusty but dry, and at that moment, it seemed as luxurious as any fine hotel. Jessie's fingers trembled with cold as she located kindling and matches, focusing on the simple task of building a fire in the stove. By the time Preston entered, shaking water from his hat and coat, she had a small blaze crackling behind the iron grate. "Tempest is settled," he said, moving to stand beside her at the stove, his own clothes dripping onto the plank floor. "He's earned his rest tonight." "So have you," Jessie replied, looking up at him with concern. In the flickering light of the fire, she could see exhaustion etched in the lines of his face. "When did you last sleep?" Preston shrugged. "I'll sleep when we reach Laramie." "That's 3 days away at least," Jessie frowned. "You can't keep going like this. You'll make yourself ill." A faint smile touched his lips. "Are you worried about me, Miss Harmon?" "Someone has to be, since you clearly aren't," she retorted, but there was no heat in her words. "At least get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." As if to emphasize her point, a violent shiver ran through her own body. Preston's smile faded, replaced by concern. "You first," he said, moving to the shelves and pulling down several rough blankets. "There should be some dry clothes in that trunk. They won't fit well, but they'll be warm." Jessie wanted to argue, to insist that he take care of himself, but another shiver made her teeth chatter. With a nod, she took the blankets and moved to the far side of the small room, where the trunk sat beneath the cabin's only window. Inside, she found men's clothing: wool trousers, flannel shirts, thick socks left by whatever cowboys occasionally used this lined shack. Modesty was a luxury they couldn't afford in their situation, so she turned her back and changed quickly, acutely aware of Preston doing the same on the other side of the room. The clothes were comically large on her smaller frame, but the dry warmth was worth any amount of inelegance. She rolled up the sleeves and pant legs as best she could, then wrapped one of the blankets around her shoulders before turning back to find Preston similarly attired in dry clothing, stoking the fire to build more heat in the small space. "Better?" he asked, glancing up at her. Jessie nodded, moving closer to the stove. "Much, thank you," Preston straightened, running a hand through his damp hair. Now that the immediate crisis of the storm was past, an awkward awareness settled between them of their isolation, of the single cot, of the intimacy forced upon them by circumstance. "Are you hungry?" Preston asked, breaking the silence. "There should be some supplies here." "Nothing fancy, but Preston," Jessie interrupted softly, "you're exhausted. When did you last sleep properly?" He sighed, the stubborn set of his shoulders relaxing slightly in admission. "Not since the night before we left the cabin." "That was almost 2 days ago." Jessie gestured to the cot. "Rest, I'll keep watch for a while." "I can't ask you to do that," he protested. "You didn't ask, I offered," Jessie said, echoing his own words from days earlier. "Trust goes both ways, Preston." Something shifted in his expression at that, a softening, a surrender to the concern in her voice. With a nod, he moved to the cot and stretched out, one arm flung across his eyes. "Wake me in 4 hours," he murmured, already half asleep. "No longer." "Of course," Jessie agreed, though she had no intention of waking him until he'd had proper rest. She sat at the small table, Preston's spare revolver within easy reach, and listened to the storm raging outside. Within minutes, Preston's breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep, the lines of tension easing from his face. Jessie watched him for a long moment, struck by how different he looked in repose, younger somehow, the habitual vigilance absent from his features. In sleep, the weight he carried seemed temporarily lifted, revealing the man beneath the burden of his past. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. Rain lashed against the single window, and wind howled around the eaves of the small shack. But inside, with the fire crackling in the stove and Preston's steady breathing providing a counterpoint to the storm's fury, Jessie felt an unexpected sense of peace. They were still being hunted. Turner's men were still searching for them. The evidence she carried still needed to reach Judge Harrington. None of their circumstances had changed, and yet, something fundamental had shifted within her. For the first time since fleeing Bitter Springs, Jessie didn't feel alone. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she would face them with this man at her side, this complex, honorable man who had risked everything to help a stranger, because it was the right thing to do. As the hours passed and the storm gradually subsided, Jessie's thoughts returned to that moment in the cabin before Joseph's warning had interrupted them. The way Preston had looked at her, the gentle touch of his fingers against her cheek, the unspoken connection that had been growing between them with each passing day. It was foolish to dwell on such things when their very lives hung in the balance. And yet, as she watched Preston sleep, Jessie couldn't help wondering what might be possible once this journey was over if they both survived to see Turner brought to justice. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her as well. Despite her intention to keep watch, Jessie found herself dozing at the table, her head pillowed on her arms as the fire burned low in the stove, and the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. She woke to the gentle pressure of a hand on her shoulder and opened her eyes to find Preston standing over her, his expression a mixture of concern and affection. "You were supposed to wake me," he said, though there was no reproach in his voice. Jessie straightened, wincing at the stiffness in her neck from sleeping in such an awkward position. "You needed the rest more than I did." Preston shook his head, but a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Stubborn woman," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, more clearly, "The storm's past. We should get moving while the trail is still visible." As they prepared to depart, gathering their now dry original clothing and checking their supplies, Jessie noticed a new ease between them, a comfortable synchronicity to their movements, as if they'd been traveling together for years rather than days. When their hands occasionally brushed or their eyes met over some small task, neither pulled away as quickly as before. Outside, the world had been transformed by the storm. The morning air was crystal clear, with that peculiar sharpness that follows heavy rain. Water droplets sparkled on every surface, turning the mountainside into a treasury of jewels as the rising sun caught each tiny prism. Tempest greeted them with a soft nickering, apparently none the worse for the night's adventure. As Preston saddled him, Jessie stood at the edge of the lean-to, gazing out at the wilderness stretching before them. "It's like the world has been washed clean," she said when Preston joined her. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's the gift of storms. They destroy, but they also cleanse." His gaze met hers. Ready for what comes next, Jessie looked up at him, at this man who had become so much more than just her rescuer in the span of a few days. "As long as we face it together." Something warm kindled in Preston's eyes at her words. Without speaking, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek in an echo of that interrupted moment at the cabin. This time, there was no sudden interruption, no reason to pull away. Jessie leaned into his touch, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. Preston's hand slipped to the nape of her neck, gentle but insistent as he drew her closer. She went willingly, her hands coming to rest against his chest as he lowered his head to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. When Jessie responded, rising on her toes to press closer, Preston's arms encircled her waist, lifting her slightly as the kiss deepened. It was a moment out of time, the world around them fading into insignificance, as they gave voice to the connection that had been building between them since that first night at the trading post. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "I've been wanting to do that since you tried to steal my horse," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Jessie laughed softly, her hands still resting against his chest where she could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart. "I'm glad I failed at horse theft, then." Preston opened his eyes, his expression growing serious despite the smile that lingered on his lips. "Jessie, when this is over," she pressed her fingers gently against his mouth, stopping the words. "Let's get through this first, then we can talk about after." He nodded, understanding the wisdom in her caution, though something in his eyes told her he already knew what he wanted that after to include. With a final soft kiss, he stepped back, though his hand found hers and squeezed it once before releasing it. "Let's ride," he said. "We've still got a long way to go." As they mounted Tempest once more, Jessie settling into what had become her accustomed place in front of Preston, she felt a new resolve strengthening her determination. Now they weren't just fighting for justice or survival, they were fighting for a future they both wanted to explore together. The next 2 days passed in a rhythm of hard riding, punctuated by brief rests. They stuck to the high country, following game trails and old Indian paths that Preston navigated with unerring confidence. Each night, they made camp in sheltered locations, taking turns keeping watch, though their sleeping arrangements had grown less formal, often ending with Jessie nestled against Preston's side, his arm protectively around her. They spoke of many things during those hours on the trail of Preston's early years running cattle with his father before striking out on his own at 20, of Jessie's dreams of a business in San Francisco, of books they'd read and places they'd seen. With each conversation, the connection between them deepened, transforming from attraction into something more profound. But they were careful not to let their growing feelings distract them from the danger that still pursued them. Preston remained vigilant, frequently stopping to check their back trail, always choosing paths that would be difficult to follow. So far, they'd seen no sign of Turner's men, but neither allowed themselves to believe they'd escaped completely. Late on the afternoon of the third day since leaving the line shack, they crested a ridge and saw Laramie spread out in the valley below a bustling frontier town with a proper rail station, government buildings, and the promise of law beyond Turner's reach. "We made it," Jessie breathed, relief washing through her at the sight. Preston's arm tightened briefly around her waist. "Not quite yet. We still need to get those papers to Judge Harrington without Turner's men spotting us. The last stretch is often the most dangerous." They made camp one final time in the hills overlooking the town, not wanting to risk entering after dark when their arrival might draw more attention. As they sat beside their small fire, Preston outlined his plan. "The circuit court is being held in the town hall," he said, tracing the route on a rough map he'd drawn in the dirt. "Judge Harrington should be hearing cases starting tomorrow morning. We'll enter town separately. I'll go first with the evidence, while you follow half an hour later." Jessie frowned. "Why separately? If Turner's men are watching the town, they'll be looking for a man and woman traveling together," Preston explained. "This way, even if they spot one of us, the other might get through." His expression was resolute. "The evidence is what matters most. It has to reach the judge. And if something happens to you," Jessie asked, not wanting to consider the possibility but knowing they had to plan for it. Preston met her gaze steadily. "Then you'll have to finish what we started." They settled into an uneasy silence after that, the reality of the next day's risks hanging heavy between them. As the fire burned down to embers, Preston took the first watch, insisting that Jessie get some rest before their final push into town. She lay wrapped in her blanket, watching the play of shadows across Preston's face as he sat vigilant at the edge of their small camp. There was so much she wanted to say to him, so many feelings that had grown in her heart over their journey together. But the words seemed inadequate against the possibility that tomorrow might change everything. Eventually, Preston turned and caught her watching him. With a soft smile, he moved to her side, sitting close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the night's chill. "You should be sleeping," he said quietly. "I can't," Jessie admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see all the ways tomorrow could go wrong." Preston took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Fear is natural before a battle, but we've come this far together." "We'll see it through." "Preston," Jessie began, then hesitated, unsure how to express the tangle of emotions within her. He seemed to understand without words. Leaning down, he kissed her softly, his free hand coming up to cradle her face as if she were something infinitely precious. "I know," he murmured against her lips. "I feel it too." They held each other through the night, speaking little but communicating volumes in the way their bodies fit together, in the gentle caresses that promised more than mere physical comfort. It wasn't a time for passionate declarations or physical consummation. Both seemed premature with the shadow of tomorrow's dangers looming over them. But in the quiet intimacy of their embrace, there was a promise for the future they both hoped would come. Dawn found them already preparing for the day ahead. They divided their meager supplies, making sure each had what they needed for their separate entries into town. Jessie changed back into her own clothing, now cleaned and mended as best they could manage on the trail. Preston did the same, once again becoming the formidable figure she'd first encountered at the trading post. When it came time for him to take the evidence, Jessie hesitated, her hand protective over the inner pocket where she'd carried the papers for so long. "I should be the one to deliver them," she said. "I'm the one who found the evidence. I should see it through." Preston shook his head. "Turner's men will be looking hardest for you. They know you have the evidence." His expression softened. "I promised to get you safely to Laramie, and I mean to keep that promise. Let me do this." After a moment's consideration, Jessie nodded and withdrew the carefully folded papers from her jacket. As she handed them to Preston, their fingers touched, lingering in the connection. "Be careful," she said, her voice catching slightly. Preston tucked the evidence securely inside his vest, then drew her into his arms for one last embrace. "Wait half an hour after I leave, then follow the trail we discussed. I'll meet you at the courthouse steps if all goes well. If not..." He pressed something into her hand. "Find Marshal Delaney. He's a good man. He'll help you." Jessie looked down to see a silver pocket watch in her palm engraved with Preston's initials. "I can't take this," she protested. "Something to bring back to me," he said with a small smile. "An incentive to find me when this is over." Words failed her then. Instead, Jessie rose on her toes and kissed him fiercely, pouring everything she couldn't say into the contact. Preston responded in kind, his arms tightening around her as if he never wanted to let go. When they finally parted, both were breathing hard, their eyes bright with emotion and unspoken promises. "See you soon," Preston said, the simple phrase carrying the weight of a vow. Then he mounted Tempest and rode down toward Laramie without looking back, his figure gradually diminishing as he descended the trail toward the town. Jessie watched until he disappeared from view, then began the longest half hour of her life, counting each minute by the steady ticking of Preston's watch against her palm. When it was time, she shouldered the small pack containing her few possessions and set off down the trail, following Preston's careful instructions to avoid the main road into town. Her nerves were strung tight as bowstrings, every sense alert for danger as she made her way toward Laramie and what she hoped would be the end of their long journey. The town was busier than she'd expected, the streets crowded with wagons, riders, and pedestrians going about their business. Jessie kept her head down as she navigated through the throng, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of Turner's men or of Preston. The courthouse stood at the center of town, an imposing two-story building with white columns flanking the entrance. As Jessie approached, her heart sank. There was no sign of Preston on the steps where he'd promised to meet her. Had something gone wrong? Had Turner's men found him? Or was he simply inside already, delivering the evidence to Judge Harrington? Indecision froze her in place across the street from the courthouse. If Preston had been captured, rushing in blindly would only get her caught as well. But if he was inside, successfully completing their mission, her absence might worry him unnecessarily. As she stood there, weighing her options, a commotion further down the street caught her attention. People were moving aside hurriedly as a group of riders approached at a trot. 5 men, hard-faced and trail-worn, with the unmistakable look of hired guns. And at their head, sitting tall on a black gelding, was Silas Turner himself. Jessie's blood ran cold. She ducked into the shadow of a nearby building, pressing herself against the wall as the riders passed. Turner was scanning the street with cold, calculating eyes looking for her. She had no doubt. They reined to a stop directly in front of the courthouse. "Spread out," Turner ordered his men. "He's got to be here somewhere. Find Reed and the woman. And remember, I want those papers more than I want them dead, but I'll settle for either." Reed. They knew Preston's name. How was that possible unless... A sick feeling settled in Jessie's stomach. Had they been betrayed? Had Joseph been captured and forced to reveal their plan? She watched as Turner's men dismounted and began to disperse through the crowded street. One headed directly for the courthouse doors. Another began questioning pedestrians, showing them something, a drawing perhaps, or a description. Jessie knew she couldn't stay where she was. Sooner or later, one of Turner's men would spot her. She needed to find a way into the courthouse to warn Preston if he was indeed inside. Keeping to the shadows as much as possible, she made her way around the block, looking for a side entrance or servant's door that might be less watched. At the rear of the building, she found what she was seeking, a small door that likely led to offices or storerooms. It was locked, of course. Jessie glanced around frantically, then remembered the small knife she carried in her boot, a gift from Preston during their journey. With it, she managed to work the simple lock, a skill she'd learned in her younger days from a less than reputable cousin. The door swung open with a creak that seemed deafening to her heightened senses, but no one was near enough to hear. Slipping inside, Jessie found herself in a narrow corridor lined with doors, probably offices for court clerks and other officials. She moved cautiously, listening for voices that might guide her to the main courtroom where Judge Harrington would be presiding. As she rounded a corner, she nearly collided with a harried-looking clerk carrying a stack of papers. "Excuse me," he said automatically, then frowned. "Are you lost, miss? This area is for court personnel only." Thinking quickly, Jessie affected a worried expression. "I'm looking for my brother. He was supposed to testify before Judge Harrington this morning, but he never came home last night. I'm afraid something might have happened to him." The clerk's expression softened with sympathy. "The judge is hearing cases in the main courtroom through those doors at the end of the hall, but you'll need to wait until he calls a recess. Court is in session now." "Thank you," Jessie said with genuine gratitude. "I'll wait there." As the clerk continued on his way, Jessie moved toward the doors he'd indicated. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure anyone nearby could hear it. Preston had to be in that courtroom. He had to be alive and well, delivering their evidence to the judge. She had nearly reached the doors when they burst open, and Preston himself emerged, accompanied by a distinguished-looking older man in judicial robes and 2 armed marshals. All 4 men looked grave. "Preston," Jessie cried, relief washing over her at the sight of him unharmed. He looked up sharply, his expression transforming from tension to joy and then quickly back to concern. "Jessie, you shouldn't be here. Turner's men are outside," she finished for him, hurrying to his side. "Turner himself is with them. They know your name, Preston. They're looking for both of us." The Judge Harrington, she presumed, looked between them with sharp interest. "This is the young woman you mentioned, Mr. Reed, the one who discovered the evidence." Preston nodded, his hand finding Jessie's and squeezing it reassuringly. "Yes, Your Honor. Miss Jessie Harmon. She risked everything to bring this information to light." Judge Harrington studied Jessie for a moment, then nodded decisively. "The evidence Mr. Reed has presented is extremely compelling, Miss Harmon. Enough for me to issue immediate warrants for the arrest of Silas Turner and several of his associates, including your former employer at the bank." "But Turner is right outside," Jessie said, glancing nervously toward the front of the building, "with at least 5 of his men." One of the marshals stepped forward. "We've already sent for reinforcements, madam. Marshal Delaney is gathering deputies as we speak. Turner won't escape justice this time." "In the meantime," Judge Harrington said, "I suggest we move you both to a more secure location. The court has quarters in the back of the building where you'll be safe until Turner is in custody." As they followed the judge and marshals toward the rear of the courthouse, Preston kept his arm protectively around Jessie's waist. She leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "You did it," she whispered. "You got the evidence to the judge." Preston shook his head slightly. "We did it, together." His arm tightened around her. "I was worried when you didn't appear at the steps." "I saw Turner arrive and thought it safer to find another way in," Jessie explained. "How did they know to look for you? How did they know your name?" A grim expression settled on Preston's face. "Joseph would never have betrayed us willingly if they have that information." He didn't need to finish the thought. Jessie's heart ached for the old man who had become their ally and friend. If Turner's men had captured him, his fate might have been terrible indeed. They were shown to a comfortable but plainly furnished room at the rear of the courthouse, clearly emergency accommodations for witnesses or officials when needed. As the marshal closed the door behind them, promising to return with news as soon as Turner was apprehended, Jessie and Preston were finally alone. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the reality of what they'd accomplished and what they'd been through together settling over them. Then, as if drawn by an irresistible force, they moved into each other's arms. Preston's embrace was fierce and protective, his face buried in her hair as he held her close. Jessie clung to him just as tightly, her heart overflowing with emotions too complex to name. "I was so afraid when I couldn't find you," she admitted, her voice muffled against his chest. Preston drew back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I told you I'd see this through," he said softly. "I keep my promises, Jessie Harmon." There was a question in his eyes as they gazed at each other, a question about what came next, now that their immediate mission was complete, but the danger had not yet passed. Jessie answered it by rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss was both an affirmation and a beginning acknowledgement of what they'd already shared and promise of what might still be. When they parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers, his thumbs gently caressing her cheeks. "When this is truly over," he said quietly, "when Turner is behind bars and you're safe, I want to ask you something important." Jessie's heart skipped a beat at the intensity in his voice, at the future implicit in his words. "I think I might already know the answer," she whispered. A smile touched his lips, warming his eyes. "Is that so, Miss Harmon?" Before she could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from the front of the courthouse. Preston immediately pushed Jessie behind him, drawing his revolver as he moved toward the door. "Stay back," he ordered, all tenderness gone from his voice as he slipped back into the role of protector. More shots rang out, followed by shouting and the sound of running feet. Preston cracked the door open just enough to peer into the hallway, his body tense and ready for action. "What's happening?" Jessie asked, her own hand going to the small knife in her boot, a pitiful defense but better than nothing. "Can't tell," Preston replied grimly. "But it sounds like Turner's men might be." The door burst open, slamming into Preston and sending him staggering back. In the doorway stood Silas Turner himself, a smoking revolver in his hand and cold fury in his eyes. "Found you," he snarled, training his weapon on Preston, who had recovered his balance but not his dropped gun. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Reed." "It's over, Turner," Preston said, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "Judge Harrington has the evidence, warrants have been issued. Even if you kill us now, you can't escape what's coming." Turner's thin lips curved in a humorless smile. "Perhaps. But I'll have the satisfaction of seeing you die first, just like I did with your friends the Millers. And then this troublesome woman who started all this." At the mention of the Millers, something dangerous flashed in Preston's eyes, a controlled rage that Jessie had never seen in him before. She could almost feel him calculating the distance to Turner, weighing his chances of reaching the man before the gun fired. "Don't," she said softly, knowing what he was thinking. "He's not worth dying for." Turner's attention shifted to her, his expression contemptuous, touching concern. "But misplaced. He's already dead, he just doesn't know it yet." As Turner's finger tightened on the trigger, several things happened at once. The window behind them shattered as a bullet crashed through it, striking Turner in the shoulder and spinning him halfway around. Preston launched himself forward, tackling the wounded man to the ground. And the door was suddenly filled with marshals, their weapons drawn and ready. Federal marshals. "Drop your weapon, Turner." The next moments passed in a blur of activity. Turner was disarmed and hauled to his feet, blood seeping from his shoulder wound, but his defiance undiminished as he was led away in handcuffs. Preston was helped up by one of the marshals, his knuckles bloodied from the brief struggle but otherwise unharmed. And through the broken window came a familiar figure, Joseph Two Rivers, a rifle in his hands and a grim satisfaction in his aged face. "Joseph," Jessie cried, rushing to the window. "You're alive." The old man nodded, a hint of his dry humor returning to his eyes. "Takes more than Turner's men to catch this old wolf. I followed them to town, thought you might need help." "That shot came just in time," Preston said, moving to stand beside Jessie at the window. "Thank you, old friend." Joseph's expression softened as he looked between them. "You found your path together, as I knew you would." He gestured toward the front of the courthouse, where marshals were leading away Turner's captured men. "It is finished now. The snake has lost his fangs." Marshal Delaney entered the room, holstering his weapon as he approached them. "Judge Harrington wants to see you both," he said. "Turner's men have been rounded up, and the judge is preparing formal charges. He'll want your statements while the details are fresh." As they followed the marshal through the courthouse, Preston's hand found Jessie's, their fingers intertwining naturally. Outside, a crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion, and now watching as Turner and his gang were loaded into prison wagons. Joseph had disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived, though Jessie had no doubt they would see him again when the time was right. For now, there were statements to give, evidence to formally present, and the mechanisms of justice to set in motion. It was nearly sunset by the time they were finally free to leave the courthouse. The events of the day of the past week had left them both exhausted but exhilarated. Turner was in a cell, his empire crumbling as associates rushed to save themselves by offering testimony against him. The nightmare that had begun in Bitter Springs was finally coming to an end. As they stood on the courthouse steps, watching the last light of day paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Preston turned to Jessie with a question in his eyes. "What now?" he asked simply. Jessie looked up at this man who had become so much more than a rescuer, or ally, this man who had shown her what true courage and honor looked like, who had shared her dangers and her dreams, who had somehow come to occupy a place in her heart she hadn't known was empty until he filled it. "Now," she said, reaching up to touch his face gently, "I believe you had something important to ask me." A slow smile spread across Preston's face, transforming his features with a joy that made Jessie's breath catch. Taking her hand, he led her away from the courthouse toward a small park nearby, finding a quiet bench beneath a spreading cottonwood tree. As they sat together in the gathering twilight, Preston took both her hands in his expression suddenly serious despite the happiness that still shone in his eyes. "Jessie Harmon," he began, his voice low and earnest, "a week ago you tried to steal my horse and I offered you a ride instead. It was the best decision I've ever made." He squeezed her hands gently. "I know it hasn't been long, but some things don't need time to be certain. I knew when I saw you standing your ground against Turner's men, when I watched you refuse to give up even when the odds were impossible. I knew when you trusted me with your life and with your heart." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "I don't have much to offer: a cabin in the mountains, a good horse, a life that won't always be easy, but everything I have, everything I am, is yours if you want it, if you'll marry me." Tears welled in Jessie's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a happiness so intense it felt almost like pain. This man, this remarkable man who had risked everything for justice and for her, was offering her a future she hadn't dared to imagine even days ago. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching on the simple word. "Yes, Preston Reed, I will marry you." Joy blazed across his face at her answer. Drawing her into his arms, Preston kissed her with a tenderness that held the promise of a lifetime of such moments of partnership, of passion, of a love forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by shared purpose. As twilight deepened into evening around them, they remained on that bench, planning their future in quiet, hopeful voices. They would stay in Laramie until the trial was complete, seeing justice done for the Millers, for Jessie's neighbor, for all of Turner's victims. Then they would return to the cabin in the mountains, their home now, where Joseph would undoubtedly be waiting with his quiet wisdom and dry humor. And after that, the future stretched before them like the vast Wyoming wilderness, challenging, perhaps, but beautiful in its possibilities. Together, they would build a life neither had dared to dream of when fate had brought them together at that trading post a lifetime ago. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Preston drew Jessie to her feet, his arms slipping around her waist as naturally as if it had always belonged there. "Let's find somewhere to rest," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Tomorrow will be another long day." "But a good one," Jessie replied, leaning into his embrace as they walked toward the hotel at the end of the street. "The first of many." Preston smiled down at her, love clear in his eyes. "The first of many," he agreed, and in those words was all the promise Jessie had ever needed. 10 years later, on a golden autumn afternoon, Jessie Reed stood on the porch of the mountain cabin that had become their home, watching as her husband and 8-year-old son returned from checking trap lines in the nearby creek. Young James was chattering excitedly, gesturing with small hands that were already showing the same deftness as his father's, while Preston listened with the patient attention he gave to everything his son said. Behind her in the cabin, Their 5-year-old daughter Elizabeth was helping Joseph prepare the evening meal, her serious little face intent on the task the old man had assigned her. Though well into his 80s now, Joseph remained a vital part of their family, his wisdom and stories a treasure to the children who called him grandfather, with the same affection they showed their blood relations. Life had not always been easy in the decade since that fateful day when Jessie had tried to steal a horse and found a future instead. There had been hard winters, lean times, challenges that tested their resolve and their resourcefulness. But there had also been joy beyond measure in the birth of their children, in the community they'd built around them, in the justice they'd seen done when Silas Turner was sentenced to hang for his crimes. They had never made it to San Francisco. Instead, Preston had surprised Jessie by building a small trading post near their cabin, at a crossroads used by travelers and the scattered homesteaders in the region. It had grown over the years into a successful business that combined Jessie's head for figures with Preston's knowledge of what frontier folks needed. It wasn't the grand merchant establishment she'd once dreamed of, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and vision. As Preston approached the cabin, James running ahead to tell his sister and Joseph about their adventure, Jessie felt the familiar warmth spread through her chest at the sight of her husband. 10 years had added a few strands of silver to his dark hair and deepened the lines around his eyes, but they had done nothing to diminish the strength and steadiness that had first drawn her to him. Preston climbed the porch steps and gathered her into his arms, pressing a kiss to her lips that held the same tenderness as their first. When he drew back, his blue eyes were filled with the love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. "What are you thinking about, looking so thoughtful?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face in a gesture that had become a cherished habit between them. Jessie smiled, leaning into his touch. "I was thinking about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best ones. If I hadn't discovered those ledgers in Bitter Springs, if Turner's men hadn't come after me, if you hadn't tried to steal my horse," Preston finished with a grin. "Exactly," Jessie laughed. "None of this would exist." She gestured toward their home, their children visible through the window, the life they'd built together. "I never could have imagined this future that night." Preston's arms tightened around her, his expression growing serious despite his smile. "I think I did," he admitted. "Not the details, perhaps, but something in me knew from that first moment that you were the beginning of everything important." Before Jessie could respond, James came barreling back onto the porch, followed more sedately by Elizabeth, both children eager to claim their parents' attention for the approaching mealtime. Preston scooped Elizabeth up with one arm while ruffling James's hair with his free hand. "Come on, you two," he said. "Let's help Joseph with dinner before he decides to feed our portions to the chickens." As the children raced back inside, Preston turned to Jessie once more, offering his hand as he had countless times over the years, a simple gesture that had come to represent all that existed between them: partnership, protection, promise. "Ready?" he asked, just as he had that morning when they'd set out for Laramie with Turner's men on their trail and an uncertain future ahead. Jessie placed her hand in his, feeling the familiar calluses and strength that had become as much a part of her life as her own heartbeat. "Always," she replied, and together they went into the home they had created, into the future they continued to build with each passing day. In the vast wilderness of Wyoming, where danger and beauty existed side by side and fortunes could change with the direction of the wind, they had found something rare and precious, a love as enduring as the mountains themselves, born in a moment of desperation, but nurtured into something that would last a lifetime. And it had all begun with a failed attempt to steal a horse and the words that had changed everything: "Ride with me instead."